story about Jesus cleaning the temple, because I want to show you that it's one of the only stories that's in all four Gospels. It reflects an historical event in the life of the pre-Paschal Jesus that was momentous and impactful and important. We're going to just wet our feet in this story today, because what I would like to do is help explain and illustrate the emotional state of Jesus. And by the state of Jesus, I'm talking about as he's depicted, stage 3, in the four gospel accounts, mainly John, because we're in John. But how that reflects Jesus, the pre-Paschal Jesus, that's the Jesus before he starts getting interpreted, right? Jesus in his actual historical existence and what he did. And so 2, possibly 3 weeks on this story. We're not in a rush, right? Let's actually learn this and see what it's about. Bible Alive John, the first Passover, Jesus cleans house, part 1. These are our resources. You know them regularly. You see them routinely. Goes really quick, I'm sorry. This Bible Alive series is about becoming considerate Bible readers to our Middle Eastern ancestors in the faith, offering a social science commentary on the Gospel called John, presenting an historically sensitive, cross-cultural comparative set of lenses with which to read, see, and hear the Gospel of John as its original audience did. Attempting to interpret John in a way that would be fair to its original author and audience, and maintaining attention and interest on important features of our own modern world. Let's jump in. As the Cherut pulled slowly out of Manger Square in Bethlehem, onto the road to Jerusalem, a woman balancing a basket on her head stepped in front of the vehicle as she began to cross the road. The driver, Palestinian, stuck his head out the window and began shouting at her, veins on his neck swelling, his face turning deep shades of red. The woman paid no attention but continued her slow walk across. A man sitting at the base of the wall across the way got up and began shouting back to the driver in equally shrill tones. The exchanges continued until the woman no longer blocked the way. Abruptly, the shouting stopped. As the driver moved the vehicle slowly forward, he turned to us in the back seats and said in lilting English, Look at the hillsides. Aren't they beautiful? Aren't they just gorgeous? Have you ever seen such beauty? A lovely sight indeed." This is all reported, a story from context group scholar Dr. John Pilch, in a real-life experience in Bethlehem. Look at the hillsides. Aren't they beautiful? Aren't they just gorgeous? Have you ever seen such beauty? A lovely sight indeed. Stopped on a dime from screaming and yelling at the woman walking across the street and the guy screaming at him from the base of the wall. While the fabled cab drivers in New York City might be able to match this scene in emotional intensity, some very important differences come to mind. Thankfully, the angry exchange between the Cherut driver and the man on the base of the wall did not erupt into violence. It didn't escalate. More surprising yet was the driver's sudden and complete shift between contrasting emotions. Such a mercurial temperament would be an impediment to getting, much less keeping, a job in the West. Yes or no? Commentators attribute Jesus' disruptive actions in the temple to anger in John chapter 2, verses 13 to 22, and its synoptic parallels, because this story is found in all four Gospels. When you hear the story, you all know the story, right? What would you say Jesus emotionally was? And some people would call it holy anger or righteous indignation. But it's funny, because none of the passages, Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John, tell us anything about emotions. They don't say, they don't express, they don't mention Jesus is emotionally this. They don't mention any emotions.
But you know he is.
But you know he is.
It's the action. They're not introspective, so they're not
And what
focused on people, their individual people.
We know he's emotional. Why do we know he's emotional, Jan?
Because he tips over the table and he's,
Has to be angry.
yeah.
So the emotions were so obvious. In other words, the author didn't have to, the evangelist didn't bother telling us, because it's implied that he was angry, right?
Well, even when they described his, before he went to his death, that he went to the garden to pray, that tears of blood came down. It's all
That's Luke. Right,
Yeah, but
right.
it's all about action.
Sure.
And what's happening. They don't go into anywhere in the Bible pretty much. This Abraham was feeling this way, or so was feeling this way. They don't talk about individual feelings.
Sure. But they convey actions, and maybe those actions suggest
feelings.
and even imply the feeling. Okay.
But we project our mentality onto it. I know you're going to tell us.
Now let me ask you, do you think eyewitnesses thought Jesus was angry?
Yes. They may have thought he was making a point, that exactly what he said.
Making a point?
His father's house was not for exchanging money. It was not for that. So how is he going to drive the point across?
But they would be able to tell he was angry, though. But do you think, Mary? The eyewitnesses?
Yeah, that he
was upset, at least.
Upset, angry. Insights from cultural psychology and Mediterranean anthropology can help modern believers gain a fresh understanding of this event, of anger in general, and of other emotions in the Bible. Let's look at the story the first time. We're going to be reading this story a couple times the next few weeks. John chapter 2, verses 13 to 25. This is part of the From Galilee to Jerusalem, back to Galilee, Oreo cookie section, which we'll be looking at later, again, from Cana to Cana. Beginning with the wedding at Cana, and then moving to the temple, and it goes on with more vignettes. Jesus brings life back to Israel. John chapter 2, verse 13. The Passover of the Judeans was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers at their business. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all, with the sheep and oxen, out of the temple. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. You shall not make my Father's house into an oikos imperio, a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. The Judeans then answered and said to him, "What sign have you to show us for doing this?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Judeans then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he spoke of the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. While he was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, in the festival crowd, many believed in his name because they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, would not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness of them, for he himself knew what was in each person. Narrator's comment. Western psychology tends to believe that English language words for emotions describe universal states of feeling. Since they are considered to be biologically rooted, emotions must be the same for all human beings, but are expressed differently. So we in the West believe. In contrast to Western psychology, experts in cultural psychology focus on differences and similarities in emotional meanings across different cultural groups. Anger, fear, and sorrow seem to be more similar than different across cultural groups. Still, the differences should not be minimized, because emotions carry different, sometimes even contradictory meanings in different cultures and are expressed in different ways. In general, men in the West, like Sheriff Frank Truman here, whose brother, Harry, is dying of cancer or some unnamed disease, keep their emotions hidden and controlled. How different it is in the Middle Eastern world of the Bible. In the Middle East, men are more openly emotional, even with other men. Think about Judas kissing Jesus in public in Matthew 26, verse 49. They do not have to justify their emotions and emotional attachments, and value spontaneity in feeling and action. Philippians chapter 1, verses 7 to 8. Paul writes, "It is right that I should think this way about all of you, because I hold you in my heart, you who are all partners with me in favor, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the innovation, the gospel. For God is my witness, how I long for all of you with the affection of Christ Jesus." Don't say Paul wasn't emotional. The spontaneity with which Jesus disrupted normal and necessary temple activity is culturally understandable and laudable. What is puzzling in this scene is the lack of appropriate reaction from his disciples or friends. As we're going to see later on, next study, this story is recorded very differently in the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, than it is in the Gospel we're studying, John. In Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the story of Jesus cleansing the temple takes place on the end of his life, his earthly life. Right? And in liturgy, we celebrate it too on Passover, on Palm Sunday. Remember, right? We do that every year. And the way the Synoptic Gospels present it, it's as if it's being presented as the catalyst which leads immediately to Jesus' arrest and execution. This is the thing where he crossed the line and went too far, and they killed him for it.
In Mark, Matthew.
You got it, Rosalinda. In Mark, Matthew, Luke. It's at the very end of his dry season ministry, because in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, he only does it for like one part of 1 year. That's his entire ministry, the dry season. But in John, we have a ministry lasting 3 dry seasons, because there's 3 Passovers. And Jesus cleanses the temple in John at the very beginning of his ministry, right after the first of his signs at Cana. That's a big, unreconcilable difference. We're going to talk about that more. But regardless of whether we're reading it in John or we're reading it in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and which of these gospel traditions best correlates to what actually happened, when did it? More than likely, folks, it probably did happen at the end of his life, and it is what led the Roman authorities to hang him. But here's the thing I want you to get. Whether it's at the beginning of his ministry, at the end, whether we're reading it in John or whether we're reading it in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the followers of Jesus, or the disciples of Jesus, shouldn't they have restrained Jesus? They would know this is going to cause him and maybe them to get killed. So before he crosses the line, good friends, restrain you. And then you can say, oh, I don't know what came over me. But they don't do that. Nobody goes to restrain Jesus. Yes, Rosalinda. How come?
If I were an eyewitness, whether disciple or not, I just want, if that's a routine thing, that essentially treating the temple like, what's that, flea market on Sunrise?
Yeah.
Swap shop?
Right.
Treating it like a swap shop structure, except when it's time to worship. I wonder, if I were an eyewitness, I would wonder, why is he freaking out over something that's routine?
We're going to look more into what
I agree with that.
we're going to look more into the socioeconomic problems and conditions and abuses next week. But right now, that's a great question, and why is this unusual for Jesus? This happened all the time. And then Lucy, maybe they agreed with him. They meaning
So they didn't say?
the disciples. Yeah, maybe they didn't think he was doing something so.
Finally, he's doing something, and they trusted him. They followed him.
We'll have to, Fina.
Back in some other classes that we had, as I recall, they didn't have, it wasn't a temple of worship, if I understand correctly. There was like a meeting place, but not a temple of worship. I might have missed.
There was worship there, but the temple was primarily the economic ingathering point of the entire surround.
Wasn't this also at the doorway, at the front?
We're going to look at that next week. We're going to break that down. All right, this is good. The juices are flowing, the minds are thinking. Let's continue. When a person's spontaneous activity might result in damage to self or to other people, that person's relatives, friends, or disciples should restrain the culprit before damage gets done. Yes or no?
Try. Yeah. Try. Sometimes it's not possible.
Well, you got 12 guys, more than that, you can do it. After being restrained, that person would protest his innocence. How could this happen? I know better than this. I don't know what came over me. Amazingly, no one tries to restrain Jesus. Immediately afterward, power-wielding authorities in the Synoptic tradition sought to destroy him. We got some basic questions to ask. Specialists ask 4 basic questions when analyzing emotions across cultures. Question 1, how does the meaning system define an experience as an emotional one, for example, anger, rather than some other kind of experience, for example, heartburn, high blood pressure. Question 2. What particular emotional meanings, for example, happiness, honor, are brought into play in different ethnic groups, Americans or ancient Judeans, and in different temporal spatial regions of the world, say like the United States or ancient Syro-Palestine? Question 3. To what extent is the experience emotionalized, for example, anger, rather than somatized, from the Greek word soma, which means body, somatized, red face, flared nostrils, in different ethnic groups and places? Fourth question. How are these emotionalized or somatized meanings learned, acquired, and triggered? If we don't address the story that we're so spuriously familiar with in terms of these questions, then we might just be guilty of reading our own American emotional meanings into the text and miss the point entirely, or distort it somewhat at least. The meaning system. On its face, Jesus' disruptive behavior in the temple was very shameful. Honor, the core value of this culture, prescribed behavior appropriate to persons, places, and things. Honor is socially accepted value, self-worth. Okay? It's a claim at value, at my value, and the public's acknowledgement of that claim. The temple was God's dwelling place, his residence among human beings. Come down from sky vault? How was that understood? Through alternate states of consciousness experiences. And boom, God is present there in the temple just as he is in sky vault. Okay? One function of the temple was to gather tithes and offerings to support temple personnel, who in turn were to redistribute the surplus to the needy. Unfortunately, too often, temple personnel retained the surplus for their own use. Temple personnel being greedy and hoarding for themselves the temple surplus, what would this later experience have produced? A condition such as high blood pressure? An emotion such as anger? The widow whose self-impoverishment for the sake of the temple Jesus lamented. We don't really read it that way. That was a lamentable thing. Jesus is not happy with that, okay? She's already impoverished as a widow. She has no voice, and she further stoops down in shameful condition. The widow whose self-impoverishment, she didn't seem angry when she put the coin in. She seemed to prefer compliance rather than defiance. Was Jesus angered by what he observed, the Synoptic Jesus, when he observed the woman putting the coin in? It's not really clear in that report. It is plausible that both the woman and Jesus, witnessing the woman, both of them experienced shame in this experience, in this event. The widow...
She should have been receiving rather than giving.
Absolutely. In fact, right after that, Jesus says, you see these stones? They're all going to be torn down. He's not praising the woman. What a horrible thing to say. If he was praising the woman and then said, oh, by the way, all her money, which is her last dime, is going to support something that's going to be destroyed. We don't read that. We don't read that carefully. We use that for money drives too. It's a big problem with this reading. Big problem. It shouldn't be used for money drives. Are fine if you're helping people. That's great. But to use this reading is a misuse. Yeah, no, it's not. The widow, by definition of her lower status in society, was forced to lower her status still further by self-impoverishment. That's what the story's about. Jesus, and perhaps the widow too, was ashamed of the shameless leaders whose perverse teachings forced this woman and others into culturally disapproved self-abasement. This and similar memories could have triggered Jesus' disruptive action in the temple. Mary, let's stop there.